So, hi everybody and welcome to this week's episode of my series When I Feel. I'm very happy to welcome my friend Victor Niquara from Berlin, who is joining me this week for this week's episode. So hello, Victor.
Hi, Yoel. Thanks for having me on the show.
So Victor has been my dear friend and colleague of many, many years as a composer and pianist, and I'm very happy you joined me for this topic. So we're going to talk about Tenderness, and we're going to talk about Schubert's C major fantasy. I mean, probably the least well-known of his three fantasies, the three, let's say, famous fantasies of Schubert. I'd say it's the one that people know that is less known, so to say. But before we get to that, let's start with Tenderness as an idea or as a word. What do you associate with that, if the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, I was actually thinking about this because it's, I think it's a very private emotion. So it's not something that I consciously think about. I don't really dissect it much. It's something I kind of do. Yeah, I don't really discuss it with people. It just kind of happens in a very private setting, and it's usually something that I think for me is shared with one other person. It's not a group emotion. You know, it's not a very public emotion for me.
But is it when you say one other person, is it like with one specific person or with one specific person at a time?
I think one specific person at a time.
Okay, but is it so you can associate different kinds of emotions related to that, or is it always the same kind of process?
It can vary. I think you can probably feel tenderness towards another being. It doesn't have to be a person. It can also be, you know, it can be an animal, for instance. You can maybe even have tenderness for a tree. I have not personally felt that, but anyway, sorry.
Would you say it's a feeling, or it's a condition, or it's an act? How do you see that?
It's first and foremost a feeling, and it expresses itself through different acts. For instance, you can hug somebody and it can express tenderness or not. It can be a tender hug or a not tender hug.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. You know, I looked it up because what I always do for every week before I start thinking of or researching about a word, I always look up the dictionary, what the dictionary says. And it was actually quite interesting the last few weeks to see what other facets of those words the dictionary gave me. This week, it was absolutely terrible because the dictionary gave me a definition that absolutely did not correspond to what I associated with the word. So it was kind of useless. And then you know, I looked at it, there's three meanings basically. One of them revolves around the idea of kindness and gentleness. I mean, I can dig the gentleness. I don't really know what to do with the kindness as much, because for me, it's not only a generous act. It's an act that has a lot to do with intimacy. Whereas generosity always has for me something unequal. You know, it's like one side giving it to a lesser privileged side in a sense. But no, it's also a different thing. The second, of course, the second definition of tenderness has nothing to do with tenderness in this sense. It's about young age, where you say like a tender child or a tender animal or whatever. And the third one is pain. You know, when you have like tenderness in your knees, it's quite so. And I didn't think about these other two at all. And even the first one kind of confused me. What do you make of this?
Well, I think we'll come back to the third one, because I have some ideas about the fantasy in regards to that. The generosity part, well, I was thinking about that. When I feel tenderness, or when I kind of get tenderness from somebody else, I think there is some giving there. Like, you have to, because it's such a private feeling, I think you have to accept that somebody's is being tender towards you. You have to kind of give in to that. So maybe a little bit of an aspect of generosity there.
That's great, because I am totally with you on the giving. I'm just wondering whether giving and generosity are always connected, in a sense that giving is absolutely not an act that has anything to do with power or with inequality. But generosity for me always has something, a little bit of a strange sub taste to it, so to say. But that's also might be wrong. I would like to take you on what you just said in terms of it's an act of giving something that you need to accept, because when I thought about it, I was trying to think, what is my definition of tenderness before I looked up the dictionary. And the first thing I thought about is that it's a form of caring, for sure, of caringness, let's say, that in a way requires the carer or the giver to allow a certain sort of vulnerability. And it's interesting that you just said that it requires the side being cared for accepting it. And I thought, in a way, it's something that requires the side giving accepting that condition. So that's a different point of view.
There's also that. There's also that. Of course, ideally, tenderness can come from both sides. There are moments where that doesn't quite happen. But I think when you're expressing tenderness, I think you're opening yourself up and being vulnerable, and you're giving yourself in from that side as well. So receiving tenderness and kind of being tender towards somebody or something requires this type of vulnerability, which you mentioned.
And would you say that it's an act that has more to do with kindness, or has a more and with and this kind of idea of gentleness or kindness, or something that has more to do with a condition of fragility or of intimacy in a sense?
Oh, I think, well, it depends how you interpret kindness. I would say both. Mm-hmm. I think it can be tender and kind. I mean, it can kind of merge together for me. I think intimacy probably is the stronger of the emotions, or the stronger of the conditions. But
the intimacy of any kind. I don't mean it in the sense of a romantic intimacy. It can be any kind.
No, I don't mean either.
Yeah.
And tenderness doesn't necessarily have to be romantic in nature. As I mentioned, you can feel tenderness towards a friend, towards a child, towards an animal, towards a tree, towards a. You can even just, as I think is often the case in music, you can have a certain emotion or a certain feeling, and it's not necessarily directed towards somebody, but it's just
for sure.
The wiring is there, and it just happens. You can just experience tenderness.
Actually, what you're describing, I mean, that's something we could talk about for an hour, but I think it's a crucial point, because I think, there's a lot of musicians that say, oh, I make music because I'd like to give to people and make people feel this and that. And I always argue that these statements are, I mean, they sound great, but I think that there's a certain degree of a little bit of dishonesty amongst, or lack of awareness among some of those people, because I don't know many musicians that while sitting on stage, they think of the lady from the 7th row and think, I would really like to give her something in this moment, or I'm right now would like the audience to feel this. I think in the moment that you make music, you feel you're only connected to the music. You're not even concerned about the audience at all, but the audience can experience something that doesn't come from you, but comes from the music indirectly.
If I can actually counter that argument and say it's very possible that there are musicians who go under the category you mentioned, but I remember hearing quite a lot of stories of people, kind of peeking behind the curtain and kind of picking one person from the audience that they choose to play for that evening. It's a very good way to also to calm your nerves, to be honest. If you're
but in a way, but that's kind of more a projection, because you need you need a specific person to have your recipient being more personal, less anonymous. Isn't it more that?
Do you need to though?
I don't know. I'm wondering, because I mean that's a whole other topic. But I'm just wondering, when you sit on stage and you play, do you actually think about the audience in terms of, right now I'm expressing this for you, or are you just in the music?
I have once. I have an experience where I have absolutely 100% done that. It was after somebody giving a talk and describing some well-known musician. I think it was somebody from a reputable string quartet. I don't remember exactly.
Okay.
And this was in some masterclass 20 years ago or something. And I remember I was going to play this Bach Prelude and Fugue, and I was extremely nervous. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to use this string. I'm going to try and play for somebody. Okay. And it came out quite well. It came out a lot better than I was anticipating before the performance. So I think it helped. So it's small sample size, but there you go.
Yeah, it's totally different. For me personally, it makes me a little more nervous to conduct for a specific person than to think of a big hall full of people that I don't know. But I see both sides. I think it's interesting also with this idea of, because I think for me, I mean, I think of music making as something I do for people all the way until the moment I go on stage, and all the way from the moment I go off stage. But I don't know. I somehow the moment that the music starts, it's for me, it's all gone, and it's not about me. It's not about them. It's just something else happens. It's just a different state of consciousness.
I think that's. I don't know, y'all. There's so much music. There's so many people. There's so many different ways to actually do it. Yeah. That's one way to do it.
That's a different topic. I don't know how we got to that, but that's a different one. But if we go back to tenderness as an idea, I think that the side or the facet of tenderness that brought me to connect this word to this piece to start with was something, for me, the first association I always have with it is the word delicate. I don't know why, something that has to do with delicacy, and whenever I think of Schubert, it's just something we can touch on later, if whether, you know, Schubert is music that is very human, or is it music that is very transcendental. But for me, I always think of something extremely delicate, and that's why I can relate to the idea of tenderness in terms of gentleness, and in terms of fragility and delicacy so much. That's the one that brings me to this piece. There's something very unconcrete about it. Can you relate to that?
Oh yeah, the very last point you made, the unconcreteness, definitely. I think the way it's put together, the fact that it's, I think, quite ambiguous, not maybe even from the point of view of feeling, but I also like what you're mentioning about the transcendent and the human. Like, how do you? This is a question of how do you interpret for instance, the opening, the opening and the first movement. Is it something that kind of floats above the world of humans, or is it something very kind of with a lot of, let's say, middle and something that kind of comes from within? Is it something above, or is it something within? Mm-hmm. I know this is just a rather unclear way of describing it, but this is kind of how I see it. And I don't know, I tend to view it as more of something floating above, and maybe when it comes back again, it's something more within. Also because there's a change of the register. First time it's a little higher on the violin, the melody, and then the second time it's...
You mean when the melody comes back at the end of the piece? Or just before the coda of the piece, in a way?
No. When just the very... So you have this opening, which anybody can hear in the recording, where there's a tremolo, there's this shimmering thing on the piano, and there's a kind of slow, solemn-ish violin tune, and this comes back later in the piece.
Yeah, that's
not the very end.
Not the very end. Okay, right.
The very end. No. It's before the, let's say, last movement.
That's what I meant, actually. For me, the last movement is kind of a coda.
Oh, you see the whole thing as a coda?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. Well,
it's like an epilogue where I always think, okay, so he could not bear all this fragility for like 20 minutes, so he had to write a very symphonic ending, because there was too much lovey-feely stuff. So at the end, there had to be some concrete, bombastic symphonicness, which is in a way such a contrast to the rest that it almost sounds unconvincing. But so we are talking about the same thing. Yeah, when it comes an octave lower at the end, the melody, yes, for sure. But let's go back to this beginning, because for me, this beginning is actually the key to this piece. And for whoever has not heard it yet, if you hear it, you will see this. You will hear this the piano introduction, which sounds like it said shimmering. It has a feeling of absolutely unconcrete, atmospheric tremolo that you almost don't know where the sound starts and when it finishes, and it sounds like I know, almost like a cloud of color. And
well, depends who's playing.
I know you'll tell me more about that in a minute, because I know that all pianists are kind of pissing themselves about having to play that introduction, and it kind of never sounds really good, or even among the greatest. So, and which we'll get to bit later. Anyway, but the thing is, after this, you have this totally unreal beginning, and then you have the violin coming with a melody and this very, very long C natural that for me is almost so fragile that as a violinist, you have to risk playing it in a way that you're not sure whether the note will even speak or not, that you're not sure if it will start or not, because it's a moment where you have to risk being somehow on the border between a clear sound production and failing, you know, and that has something to do with this delicacy, with this allowing this vulnerability. And it's actually, the melody kind of grows from nothing and it becomes more and more concrete, but only when the next episode starts, when the variation starts or the allegretto start, that's where I feel that it becomes a real, let's say, conversation between violin and piano. In the beginning, it's all about something unreal, kind of going back and forth between being real and being not real. But yet at the same time, I always feel it's extremely human. It's like the story or the of a human, let's say, experimenting with vulnerability, experimenting with tenderness, with caringness, with allowing fragility and risking that hurting you and so on. But it's always a very human story. Whereas if I think of some pieces, let's say, or whether it's Mozart or whether it's other things, where I always think I have the feeling the composer is describing something that is about more than us. It's, you know, it's not a personal narrative, a personal story, but a higher idea. And in this case, I always have the feeling it's about personal storytelling.
I think that's a valid point. I feel the human aspect actually comes in the theme of the variations,
Okay.
which comes later in the piece, which is a reworking of his song Sei mir gegrüßt. And I believe the more human side comes there. My story would be as follows: like the beginning is kind of forming into the human side. It's still kind of ethereal. It's I don't know, the music of the spheres, and it's kind of slowly coagulating into something more human. And it's at first a little bit weird, like in the allegretto, like it's not quite formed as a human, and then it becomes a human in the variation, sort of. And it's with each variation is kind of learning to walk, learning to move, but it's kind of formed. And then towards the end, where you have the really fast coda after this theme comes back, this theme of the song, we have this mad coda, you know, this mad presto. They're kind of, it kind of feels like it dissipates into sound, because at the beginning of the piece, it's a C major chord, but it's kind of, and yes, it's you know, it's a harmonic progression, but it's kind of just sound in the end.
Tell a little bit about what it's like to play that.
It is. It can be very frustrating, because if you're, I mean, for me, I've had days. I mean, I played it around 10 years ago once, and I found it quite difficult to do at that time, because
I remember actually the first time I ever heard it live was when I was page turning for you playing it.
I'm sorry. Well, yes, it is very tough, because you're starting, you're on your own. It's extremely quiet. You're talking about fragility on the violin. Well, in the piano, it's about the same thing. The advantage of the violin is that you can adjust the sound a little bit. In the piano, if you've plotted that first note, yeah.
But if you could describe to somebody who's not a pianist, what is the technical challenge of playing that beginning? What's hard about it?
It's you have to play a lot of very fast notes in a position that's not necessarily comfortable, extremely quietly, and you are. I would say. I mean, you know, somebody who was it? Maybe Richter. Anyway, somebody said there's no such thing as bad pianos. It's just bad pianists. In some cases, this may be true. Definitely not in this piece. You need a piano. Really need a piano that helps you. Otherwise, you are just, you know, you are in firefighting mode. So something's not going to be quite perfect. So you're just trying to make the best out of a bad situation if you don't have a piano that helps you. So it's like yeah.
No, but when I first heard that beginning, this kind of this shimmering tremolo, which sounds like it's supposed to be so quiet that you're almost not sure if there's sound or not, that made me wonder back then whether, if Schubert actually had a little bit more success in getting his symphonies performed, whether he would not write it for orchestra. Because to me, it sounded so orchestral in the sense that it felt like the texture should be so tender that you're almost not sure whether the sound whether it's audible or not. And of course, a piano it's an amazing instrument, but it's a percussion instrument in the sense that the moment that a hammer hits a string, it hit a string. And you cannot, like, as you said, with a violin, where you can basically kind of scoop along the way of a string, you can't do that obviously with the piano. So when I first heard that, I thought, like, well, to me, I always think, I mean, it sounds very kitschy, but I always think of a lake or the seaside, but mainly a lake, when you have the sunset and you see the reflection of this kind of glimmering light on the water, where it's you never know, is it the reflection, but it's never concrete. You see these little lights that come back and forth.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I think of when I feel of that beginning, which what made me, when I actually heard you play it at the time, go on and do that arrangement, which we all know about. I mean, just to tell everybody, I did an arrangement a few years later of this piece for a symphony orchestra in a sort of a Schubert-sized symphony orchestra, and try to take in all those different colors that Schubert made the piano and the violin do, and basically curse every time that they don't manage to, take that and see what an orchestra could give to that kind of endeavor. And I started with this very, very tender tremolo of the strings, and then have the violin melody come with the oboe. But that's a never matter. But what made me want to do that was that I thought, how does it sound when you have an instrument that can provide that unreal tenderness in the beginning?
I think that's a very, very valid way to go about it. Now, the one thing I would say is, as ethereal and light and, you know, shimmering and almost not there as it should be, I think it does need just a tiny little bit of what the piano has, which is this sort of bell-like quality. If you can just kind of cut, you know, you cut the bell sound and you don't get quite the attack, just the, you know, a bit of the attack and some of the afterglow of that, then I think that would be sort of a sound. And you mix that with strings, and I think that would be sound.
So piano and strings.
I don't know, just I would just do it with electroacoustics at this point.
Electroacoustics. Wow, what do you think?
You could probably get that sound there.
But what do you think would Schubert say about an electroacoustic arrangement to his piece nowadays?
I think he'd be too busy writing stuff for theremin to care.
No, I think I'm with you there. I think composers would be absolutely amazed by the possibilities that our time has to offer, and I think they'd be thrilled about expanding the palette that they had then.
I mean, I'll mention something. There's some discussion about this piece. I mean, being quite being Schubert's attempt at a sort of a virtuoso violin piece. Also, the piano part has a certain degree of virtuosity. How successful that is a different discussion, but there's definitely that. And that's not something he had done, you know, a huge amount.
No, almost none at all. Almost never, yeah.
I mean, there are stuff like, if you look at the Wander Fantasy for piano, there's a fair bit of virtuoso writing in that. So, for instance, if he was open to trying other stuff, if he lived nowadays, I'm sure he'd at least have a peek at some electroacoustic possibilities. Maybe he'd write something in that style, maybe not. But yeah.
You know, it's interesting that you say the word virtuosity, because I wanted to touch upon that. In a way, I really hate pieces that just all are there to do is show off. Or it doesn't matter whether it's Paganini or whether it's, I don't know, for voice, like some bel canto operas that are only there to show what I can do. I find it very vain and usually very boring. And what I thought about what makes this piece for me so incredible and just not leave it at the sort of hollow virtuosity is exactly that through this kind of tenderness, that even when the passages are hard, even when the violin has these incredible passages that are so awkward that it's really some of the hardest pieces to play, even when the piano has these incredible jumps and all that, there is incredible grace and delicacy and tenderness to those passages that makes it the virtuosity poetic for me, and therefore never sort of virtuosity for the sake of virtuosity, but always as a mean of expressing a greater idea. And that's this form of delicacy that is so hard to achieve that we always try with this piece.
I like that. I like that perspective. Though I think there's some of that, but it's interesting. I think some of these, not all of them, like some of them I agree with you are quite delicate, but I think some of these passage work, I would say in the last movement, which you see as the extended coda, and in the allegretto, I think some of these things are actually quite violent, and I would like to suggest that there's actually, for me, if I just listen to the harmonies and the rhythms in this piece, I think there's a fair bit of just pretty brutal stuff. It's not necessarily always marked fortissimo, but some of the contrasts and some of what I get out of it is actually quite brutal.
That's actually one of the reasons why I did that arrangement to start with, because I always thought with the orchestral setting, you have the chance, because I think also I agree with you that this piece has huge amount of contrast in it. Contrast between the fragility and this super symphonic ending, this very, very sort of a statement-like ending, and also the contrast between, you know, different colors, this song-like intimacy, and then the more extroverted bits, which is why I thought the orchestra would give you also the possibility of going between this very chamber music like solos of the winds to have this full symphony orchestra contrast for the ending. So I agree with you, there's a huge amount of contrast, but if you look at it from a philosophical point of view, you could argue that through this fragility, or that, you know, this whole journey of fragility leads to strength, that is that which is the ending, because there's all these variations are always, even for me, these passages, even when they're extremely fast or loud, there's always incredible grace to them until the last bit, which you call the last movement, comes, where it becomes rough. So wouldn't you even say that in a way the fragility and the delicacy led to real strength somehow?
For me, for my subjectivity, that feels like a bit of a stretch. I don't necessarily quite see it like that. Also because I don't know. I see sort of for me, it's all more sort of continuous. It stays more in the same world rather than, you know, suddenly becomes stronger. And also, I don't see
between the very, very beginning, between the introduction and the end. For you, there's an arch that goes all the way through.
Absolutely, 100% from beginning to end. Just because there are subtle links between the themes, subtle links between the harmonies, I would say not so subtle links between the different keys. And very importantly, I wouldn't be saying this if the song wouldn't come back right before the very end. Like, if that wasn't the case, I would say it would be much more of a linear.
Yeah, I get that. You know that the premiere was very unsuccessful. People actually really hated it when it was performed. Until this very day, I have the feeling that, I mean, didn't hate it for the reason that we sometimes do, for being so hard to play. People, like the audience really did not know how to digest that at all. And I always wonder, you know, people say that about Mahler's Seventh Symphony, about the finale, that he just wanted to write something loud and accessible for people to go home and be happy. Of course, it sounds very like a very trivial reason for a piece as divine as this. But I always wonder whether the ending was not almost like a point where there was so much intimacy in the music that forced you as a listener to be confronted with your emotions in that moment, that in a way he needed almost a ceremonial ending for it to somehow go back from that. Otherwise you cannot be, I mean, it would have been an absolute scandal to send people home with that song coming back and just finish in that kind of in that tender emotion. And that's the same for his string quintet, which is written around the same time in very similar, same key and so on.
I don't know, doesn't the F minor fantasy for hand piano end kind of quietly?
I don't know, you must know. But I think we're running out of time soon. So in any case, let's wrap it at that. Everybody can find the link to the recording down there. And Victor, thank you so much for joining me this week. And everybody else, join me next week, same time, same place. And thanks so much.